All right. Well, welcome everyone to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series, hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're so glad to have so many of you joining us today. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here at the University of New Mexico. A couple of heads up today for our talk today. If you have any questions for our panelists who have reserved plenty of time at the end for those questions, you can ask any question you feel comfortable with in the Q&A box. Just know that we're going to be holding on to those until the end of the presentation portion of this discussion. We try to get to as many as possible. Just forgive us if we can't get to yours. If you are pursuing continuing education credits, if you're pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet that will come into the chat as I'm talking right now. So it should be right there in the chat there. And for those of you that are pursuing APA continuing education credits, that will be posted around the last 5 minutes or so of the presentation. You do have to open your link before you exit this webinar and make sure you save your certificate after you complete the survey, because we at UNM do not have copies of those and we don't have access to those surveys going forward. There will be a recording link and PowerPoint slides available to those of you probably sometime later today. And as a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we'll have Dr. Joel Dvoskin, who will be covering class action suits against mental health and criminal legal institutions. But this week, I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers who will be discussing the risks and benefits of having a social media presence as a forensic psychologist. We have Dr. David Ley and Dr. Molly Persky. Dr. David Ley is a clinical psychologist, sex therapist, and author based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He's the author of several books and research articles on sexuality. Dr. Ley serves on the New Mexico Board of Psychologist Examiners and has been qualified as an expert witness on numerous psychological topics. He's a frequent guest in media around the world with appearances in sources such as New York Times, CNN, Time Magazine, to Hustler and Playboy magazines. He also has a very strong Twitter following of over 25,000 followers and over 7,000 tweets. Dr. Molly Persky earned her doctoral degree in clinical psychology from Pacific University, where she currently serves as an adjunct professor teaching psychology and law. Following completion of her doctoral degree, Dr. Persky completed a fellowship at the Center for Behavioral Medicine's Department of Forensic Services, conducting criminal responsibility, competency to proceed, sexually violent predator evaluations. Now a licensed psychologist in Oregon, she works in a private practice, conducting a variety of psycholegal and forensic evaluations. She also has extensive experience providing expert testimony, supervising pre- and post-doctoral graduate students, and conducting research on psycholegal topics. You will not find a Twitter account for her. So David, Molly, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, can I say how thrilled and excited we are to have you joining our series. Thankful for you both sharing your expertise and your different perspectives on this issue for us today. I will now turn it over to you.
Thanks for having us, Anthony. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with the presentation. Let us hope that works. It's always, kind of a dance. Molly, I can see you. Would you nod if it's sharing?
Yeah,
okay,
to me.
Cool. All right, Molly, let's jump in, and why don't you kind of introduce how we ended up doing this topic?
Yeah, so this kind of came about pretty organically. I had done a presentation for this purpose in November on a different topic, and as part of the process, Anthony had asked me to send in a photo of myself to go on the brochure. And I responded saying, hey, I would prefer to not have my picture online. And he was very cool about it. And that was kind of that. And then he reached out a couple months later and said, hey, we're doing this topic. And I'm making an assumption that you might be a person who is sort of on the side of not having social media. Which is accurate. And I think my relationship with social media is probably pretty typical. I had Facebook when it first came out, and had it through college and into grad school. And then kind of my first year of grad school realized that it was very distracting. I was on it during class. I was on it when I should have been studying. And I made the decision to give it up. And didn't really think it would be forever, but that was kind of around the same time that Instagram and Twitter became popular. And so I sort of organically kind of missed that wave of social media. And then as I started getting into forensic work, became much more aware of how easy it is to find information about people online. And sort of from that point on, kind of made a more conscious decision to minimize my online profile as much as possible. So that's kind of how I came into this. I don't have a stance necessarily one way or the other, where I think social media is good or bad, but on a personal note, I just choose to minimize that.
So I meant to say at the beginning, Molly and I are going to do a relatively brief kind of presentation covering the relevant kind of issues, facts, policies, guidelines, etc. We've left a lot of time at the end for questions, so please, we'll cover questions then. And we expect that there's going to be a lot of engagement. Anthony reached out and asked me to do this. Because, as said, I have a pretty significant public presence, and my understanding is that a number of psychologists, and as we'll see, a number of clinicians in the healthcare field are really struggling with whether social media presence is appropriate for them or not, and how they navigate it. I will say that, and Anthony's wrong, I have way more than 7,000 tweets, but I'll tell you why they don't show up. I actually got asked to, I got forced, I guess, kind of, to step onto Twitter probably about 10 years ago, after I had done a show in Australia, and they flew me down, gave me a week in Australia to do this TV show. I think I was talking about sex addiction and challenges to, to the idea and concept. And then they said, hey, we want you to live tweet when the show airs. And I'm like, well, I don't know what that is, but you just gave me a week in Australia. I guess I can do that. All right. So I was willing to do that. And I have found, in fact, that for me, social media presence and public presence has really been actually pretty significantly beneficial. And we'll talk about some of those benefits and some of the risks. Here on the left is a tweet that I put out a couple of years ago, right after the Atlanta killing. Robert Aaron Long killed a number of people at Asian massage parlors. And I was listening to the news about it, and I said, boy, this sounds familiar. This guy feels like a lot of the people that I see that are online and in porn addiction treatment. And I said, I went ahead and I put out a formal, on Twitter, a formal prediction that this guy was going to turn out to be a porn addict. And it's funny because 12 hours later, I was proven completely right, that he actually does have a pretty long history of treatment in porn addiction treatment facilities. But that tweet is kind of blurry. And why is it? It's blurry because the tweet is gone. I have auto delete set up on my Twitter and several of my other social media kind of presences, so that information doesn't stick around too long, and that's intentional. One reason, there used to be a really aggressive online stalker that harassed myself and several other folks in the field around pornography, effects of pornography, and questions around pornography addiction. So that the reason it's blurry is that tweet isn't really available anymore. Now, I'll recommend that if you're a forensic psychologist and you have concerns about attorneys seeing your tweets, you may want to set something up like that, or your social media stuff, because it's relevant not just for Twitter, but for Instagram, TikTok, etc. It just makes it a little harder for people to find some of that stuff and potentially try and use it against you. On the right is a tweet that I had made after Harvey Weinstein came out, quote unquote, as a sex addict, and used that to explain why he was sexually harassing people. And it's weird when comments you make in social media all of a sudden end up in mainstream national news. So it really gives you pause about how significant these seemingly go away quickly words you put on the internet can stick around. One of the things that we're seeing with this is that there is a very significant generational shift. It's funny, Molly mentions, she was on Facebook, in high school and college, and I'm thinking, oh, wait, God, I was on MySpace. What we're seeing is that more and more folks coming into psychology practice have histories as young people being on social media and having social media being a significant part of their social life and personal interactions, and then having to wrestle with what do I do with that now as a professional? What is the role of that as psychology moves forward? There are some very significant industry shifts in approach to privacy and ethics around this, and the challenges and the conflicts between personal privacy and professional ethics. We're going to walk through a couple of those conflicts. And the thing that I have to say is that this is absolutely a moving target. Everything is moving fast and furious with all of this, and things that seem unclear now may be clear tomorrow, and things that seem clear today may be unclear tomorrow. The APA has a statement, I won't read the whole thing, but they make a very clear point that as regards optimal use of social media. And I recommend reading these guidelines and the following guidelines we're going to show you. But they make the point that psychologists have the same rights and limitations on public speech. But psychologists should be prudent not to exercise their speech in ways unethical, defamatory to individuals or the profession. And that's one of the complicated things that I think then comes up and is made even more explicit by the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards. This is the group that puts out the EPPP. They are an association of the state boards of psychology in the United States and Canada. Again, I will make clear, Anthony mentioned, I sit on the board of psychology for New Mexico, but I am not speaking on their behalf. Any comments from me today are solely me as a psychologist, okay? But I will tell you, I stepped onto the board because I think that it is important that our regulatory groups hear from folks that are not just retired psychologists from different generations and different kinds of worlds. I wanted to be on the board so that we were able to, speak to issues for younger psychologists that could impact them. ASPPB actually recommends that boards intervene on social media if such behavior undermines the reputation of the profession or the trust the public has in the profession. I will say that I have raised concerns to the ASPPB that I think that they are potentially encouraging boards to challenge First Amendment freedom of psychologists with this statement. And First Amendment rights are some of the issues that are coming up in this debate, as we'll see.
And so I think it's interesting to look at least for forensic psychologists, what the guidelines are. And unfortunately, there are really no guidelines specific to forensic psychologists. So the specialty guidelines, which were updated in 2013, don't speak specifically to social media use. There was some information from the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law, essentially saying, you can use social media, that it can be beneficial, and it might be accurate. And then the American Bar Association actually specifically advises attorneys to rely on social media for the defense of their clients. And so one of the things that I think we're going to spend the bulk of this presentation talking about social media for personal use as psychologists, but we thought that it was important to talk about using social media as a tool for information gathering. I think it's important to highlight that social media is a relatively new concept, so the research is fairly sparse. There was some research done in 2016 that looked at clinicians' attitudes towards using internet-based data in forensic and therapeutic contexts. And they found that 23% of clinicians admitted to searching the internet for therapy clients, and 39% of forensic evaluators admitted to using social media as collateral information. And then there's been a few studies in the last couple of years. I think some things to highlight about this, in general, information that's obtained through social media is permitted in court. So for example, they've used social media posts for potential terrorism cases. They've used it in custody disputes. And information that's used through social media can be useful. And so when we look at the research, what we're finding is that a large percentage of forensic psychologists admit to using social media information as part of their information gathering. And I won't get too in detail, but I thought I'd bring up some things that were interesting. So that there was a study done in 2018. The sample was graduate students and professional psychologists. And I found it interesting. They found that more professionals admitted to using social media than graduate students. And I think it's interesting to kind of think about that generational shift where we think more young people are likely using social media. I imagine graduate students as a whole are younger than professionals might be. And it's interesting to think about them being more sort of conservative in their use of social media. And I don't know if that's from just kind of growing up with social media and recognizing kind of the dangers of using it, but I think it's interesting to think about. And what the research has told us is that there's really no general consensus. So most participants in this study believed that searching the internet for examinee information was neither required nor prohibited. So it's not something you have to do, and it's not something you shouldn't do. But what we found is that much of the kind of type of evaluation that uses social media tends to be mental state at the time of the offense. And I think part of that is because it's sort of time stamped, right? You get a really clear kind of timeline of somebody's thoughts and behaviors. And oftentimes we're doing these evaluations, months, sometimes years later. And so having social media to kind of go back and look through and see here the day before the offense, this is the kind of information that they're posting. Another study was done by my colleague, actually, Dr. Adam Coffey. This was published in 2018. And they looked again at forensic psychologists' use of social media as collateral data. And they found that about 64% of participants admitted to using social networking sites as collateral sources. And that was similar for folks who were in private practice and state hospitals. 53% reported that material was included in discovery. And I think those of you doing forensic work, I certainly have seen an increase over the years where I'll just get Facebook posts in the discovery packet, which I think can be really helpful. And then 42% actually reported that they conducted their own online searches to find evaluee information. And what I liked about this article was that it provided some really good qualitative information about using social media. And what they found was that, like I mentioned, the majority were using it for mental state evaluations. It was also used in risk or threat assessments and some competency to stand trial. And they found that using social media allowed them to assess the validity of reported symptoms. So they could sort of corroborate a defendant's story. So one participant said they used social media to evaluate a person's religious statements and whether or not they were delusional. One person, their evaluee was, they thought malingering intellectual disability. And so they went on their social media to kind of see like their writing style, their grammar, what are they able to convey in written form? And it sounded like practitioners were using this in both civil and criminal. So there was a lot of kind of talking about social media use as a gold standard for child custody evaluations, with the idea that parents will often cite social media as proof of another parent's misconduct. Other psychologists use social media to score risk measures, to determine capabilities, and also to obtain behavioral observations.
Molly, I'll certainly say
yeah.
I am seeing social media presented to me in lots of cases now about both sexuality and claims of recovered or repressed memory, because I testify in both of those. And social media is being presented as relevant to those issues more and more and more. You know, 2 cases I'm in right now, I spent hours reviewing, you know, lots and lots of Facebook messages between people back and forth. And as I was doing that and with this training in mind, I realized that if you're not familiar with social media, using it yourself, I think that there are nuances of some of these technologies and communications that can slip by, that you may not understand.
Absolutely. So that's a great segue into the next slide. There's a really good book. I have a picture of it here. That's was published, and I think can be really helpful for people who are interested in learning more about this. It offers a lot of best practice guidelines for using social media. And I wanted to kind of talk about some of the guidelines that they bring up in the book, because I think they're important. And one of the main things was kind of, as David was saying, like, how do you authenticate this information? So, you know, I think everyone knows that someone can log into someone else's social media and post something. How do you know that that person was actually the one posting it? Same with using whole unedited sources. I think, you know, I've been learning a lot about like deep fakes. I watched one, there was like, I think a famous one of Morgan Freeman, where he's talking about, it looks like Morgan Freeman, it sounds like him, but he's talking about how it isn't Morgan Freeman, that this is a deep fake. And I think as the technology grows, we need to be really careful about how much weight we place, and we need to be able to authenticate some of that information. So I think a good way to do that is to consult with the retaining attorney. Some researchers have found that psychologists who are practicing forensic evaluations will only use social media information that's provided by the attorney. So rather than going out and looking on your own, you kind of assume if it's from the attorney, then it's been authenticated. One of the other things they talk about is to not include social media info in isolation, much like any other collateral source. You know, it shouldn't be the only thing you're using to diagnose somebody. Also important to be aware of your biases. So as you're going through someone's Facebook or Twitter, you might find information about that person. Let's say you find that they have different political views than you. Being able to put that aside and not let it bias your opinions about that person. And then the last thing is to make sure you're listing the social media as sources of information. I think that's really important. Oh, go ahead.
I will just say, as Molly said, you know, consult with a retaining attorney, but always kind of have your eyes open. I had a wild situation with a case involving an underage female sending, you know, naked selfies to an adult that was part of the case, and the attorney sent me a flash drive with all the information related to the case. And before I opened the flash drive, because I remembered what was involved in the case, I asked the attorney, you know, you didn't just send me naked pictures of an underage person on this flash drive, did you? And the attorney said, why don't you send me that flash drive back? And then we worked with the attorney's staff to edit the pictures, because I wanted to make sure I was not violating any law or in possession of illegal material. So again, because this is all so fast and moving so quick, I think it is really a place where we have to have our eyes open.
Yeah, I had a really similar experience recently. I was doing a psychosexual evaluation on a woman who had been charged with bestiality, and she had sent a video of her engaging in bestiality through, I think it was Snapchat, to unfortunately an unsuspecting person. And same kind of thing, I received the discovery and had a moment of like, oh, wait a minute, I wonder if this video is on here. And sure enough, it was. So I think it's always, whether you're looking on your own or you're getting it from the attorney, be mindful that this might be, as we are using social media more and more, be mindful that this information might pop up. And yeah, I think like ultimately, there's kind of a lack of guidance, I think, overall from these specialty boards on how to approach this topic. And I think that's interesting given kind of what we know, what research tells us, which is that a large percentage of practitioners admit to using social media as collateral sources. And because this information is so readily available. I mean, you can pull up anything on your phone within seconds. And so I think as we progress and as technology becomes better and better, we're going to need to really figure out methods for keeping this organized and kind of safe for everybody.
I agree. Now, researchers, are arguing that researchers, scientists, including psychologists, not only are they using social media, but they must in order to ensure that up-to-date, critical, correct, valid, accurate information is getting out to the public, as opposed to the translated, interpreted, oftentimes misinterpreted research or material that we might put out there that then gets digested by the media or by other people who misrepresent your work. One of the really valuable things that I've seen with social media is that there is a direct interaction and a direct connection between researchers, authors, experts with people interested in the field. Benefits to a social media presence for psychologists and forensic psychologists, first and foremost is simply marketing. I at this point, I get media requests, I get legal requests, expert witness requests, consulting requests, speaking requests, and I even got the contract for my third book exclusively from social media. It facilitates a more significant participation in social issues and dialogues. As said, I mean, see the tweet that I put out about Harvey Weinstein that ended up in the New York Times. Whether we want to have that presence or not, I think is a different question. But the more understanding we can have of how social media impacts our patients and cases is benefited from us experiencing social media. We get to practice. One of the things that I've really learned and benefited from is that by using social media, talking about things I'm writing about, for instance, I get to see how the general public responds to these ideas, formulations, and even the wording that I use. It facilitates very significant professional contacts. There is, online therapist Twitter and therapist Facebook, whether it's groups or just informal groups that form with people sharing research and information. I get access to research, oftentimes pre-publication through online and social media kind of contacts. Many folks are now using social media to recruit participants for research and getting much larger participant samples by doing so. This is an interesting example of some of the support that people can get and professionals can get through social media presence. A couple of years ago, you may remember that there was a article published in, I think, a cardiac journal by physicians that basically told young physicians or med students not to post pictures of themselves in bikinis, pictures of themselves at bars, drinking, stuff like that. And noting that the authors did not recommend that males not post pictures of themselves at the beach. And what was really very cool, I thought, was that female practicing independent doctors started posting pictures of themselves in bikinis to push back against the social shaming or norming that was in there. Go ahead.
I'll just add one thing to that last slide. I think I will say that despite not having Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, I do have a LinkedIn. And I think that there is some benefit to that in terms of credibility in establishing that. And I've heard from some contacts that has been a place where they've gotten referrals. If you're acting as an expert witness, people who, attorneys want to know how kind of your background, and having a LinkedIn can help support that as well.
Agreed. There are risks, to be clear. Safety, as said, I've been stalked and harassed, both online and in the real world. Have had security guards had to be present at presentations I've given because of online threats that were made against the presentation. Your privacy is at risk. Now, I will say that as Molly said, she tries to keep a smaller presence on the internet. I went the absolute alternative direction, and instead of having a small presence, there is so much media out there that about me or referencing me that you really can't find any personal information about me. It takes a lot of work. And if you ever end up in a situation where you're hiring people to clean up your public image or your internet presence, that's what they do. They don't actually scrub or delete information because it's almost impossible to do. Instead, what they do is they try to get a lot more information out there that comes up higher in the search engines to drive down the information that you don't want present. That happened organically for me. I have seen over recent years that some online activists and opponents of whatever position you might have are now using it to file complaints, including to your board. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. You can end up in multiple roles if you interact with people online in social media, and then potentially interact with them as a clinician or as a professional. I have patients that follow me on social media, but I don't follow them, and that's a personal role I developed. Molly raised the really interesting information around test security.
Yeah, and I think there's a slide kind of towards the end where we'll talk more about that, but I think that's an interesting one as well. And I'll add that if you for those of you who've never done this, after this presentation, you might think about just Googling yourself and seeing what information shows up. I think you'll be surprised. I know I was, to see like addresses, family members, prior jobs, education, and I think there are ways to minimize that information, but it's also, I think, for more savvy internet users, I think it's not hard to pay like $5 and access way more information about people. So as much as you think you're kind of getting this stuff offline, as David mentioned, nothing is truly ever offline.
And unfortunately, even if you are trying to keep your social media completely personal, you may have just a personal social account with family and friends where you are not a psychologist. But if you say something in that account as about psychology or about, current political dynamics or social dynamics, somebody can screenshot that and then share it with or without your permission. And that's one of the recommendations from ASPPB and APA is that unfortunately we have to be mindful of our voice all the time. I have been confronted by attorneys in depositions, not at trial, where they throw pictures of social media statements that I've made in front of me and try to shake me up and ask me to defend them. Honestly, I'm not sure if judges would allow that at trial, and I don't know if it wouldn't backfire because many of the jury also are going to have social media presences and understand, I think, just kind of how some of that might work. There are strategies, though, to mitigate some of the risk. Oh, I didn't say this. If you have apps on your phone for social media, any social media, and you ever use that phone to contact attorneys or patients or clients, etc., the social media apps oftentimes intentionally or unintentionally will mine your contact information and then put those people up as potential friends or contacts to you on LinkedIn or Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. So frankly, my recommendation is if you use social media, use it on a phone that is different from a phone that you use for any professional activity. Again, that's one of the strategies to mitigate risk. The number one issue that comes up around these as a problem is anything related to patients. Don't ever say anything on social media related to any patients that you see, even if you think it's unidentifiable or not innocuous. That's one of the consistent problems that comes up. I have discussions with patients and attorneys where I give them informed consent that I have a significant public presence. And if that's a problem, that they need to talk to me about it and create an open door so that if a patient ever sees something I say and has a problem with it, that they can come and talk to me. If you are on social media, don't comment on specific cases. Be mindful when you identify yourself as a psychologist. And you'll see if you look at some of my social media, I identify myself as a shrink. Is that a protection? I don't know. Maybe we'll see. We'll see. But you'll see a case in a minute where identifying as a psychologist was specifically identified as a problem for social media. Refrain from publishing sensitive, secure information, obviously test results. As Molly said, Google yourself. I have Google alerts set up so that anytime anything gets published about David Lay or Dr. David Lay, I get emails letting me know what is out there so that I can take a look at it and see if there's anything I need to do about it. I have written to authors in some cases of those articles to correct things that were said about me. And know that as forensic psychologists, we may end up talking about issues like pedophilia, crime, celebrity mental health that are hot button issues that are going to be quoted and cited and shared in the media. This is absolutely a quick moving issue. The regulators, boards across the continent and across the world, frankly, are seeing increasing numbers of complaints related to licensee psychologist use of social media. Many of those are related specifically to patient confidentiality. Again, as one of the significant issues. Note, however, that this survey of psychology regulators noted that regulators themselves have been slow to adopt social media in their own work. So again, as I said, people that are evaluating your presence on social media oftentimes themselves do not have a social media presence from which to evaluate it. Jordan Peterson, God love him, is one of the, I think, sort of poster children right now around being a psychologist and having a controversial online presence. And his board of psychologists is working with him and has him in discipline and is trying to send him to some social media training around his presence. And one of the things that they are certainly looking at and thinking about about is what role and influence does Jordan's presence have on the view of psychology and psychologist in Canada. The COVID pandemic has been an absolute test case for clinician presence with social media. There's a law in California right now that is, prohibiting COVID-19 misinformation by clinicians, and there's a lot of concern about how constitutional that law may be. We saw during the pandemic big questions about whether doctors and licensed clinicians who spread quote false information about COVID should have their licenses challenged. And this is the case for psychologists as well as medical doctors and RNs. Certainly, I saw psychologists that were saying things about masking, or saying things about vaccine, or saying things about social distancing online, and having questions raised about their credibility as a clinician. It is uncharted territory as these challenges and questions around COVID-19 misinformation raise concerns about clinicians' right to free speech. Ryan Cole is a Washington pathologist whose medical board has just recently begun sanctioning him because they believe that his statements around hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin challenge the degree of public trust in licensed physicians in Washington. This is from an article. There's a citation in the next slide. That really looks at this question. What can the government do when restricting free speech of clinicians as regards COVID-19 and misinformation? They can probably impose sanctions for presenting false information to get personal benefit, like selling consulting or speaking gigs or whatever. They can probably threaten action against professionals whose speech to patients is incorrect. They can probably enforce legal actions on healthcare organizations and enforce restrictions adopted by private professional or self-regulatory groups. So the APA can make restrictions, but it is likely that the government cannot restrict professional health information that is made not in connection with patient care, even if it is false or misleading. They probably cannot enforce restrictions involving information about political views or skepticism of government policy. 2012, North Carolina Board of Dietetics tried to restrict a unlicensed person who was giving paleo information on social media. That case finally was settled in 2015 when the board admitted that they didn't have the ability to regulate people that are not licensed. However, in 2019, a federal court upheld Florida law requiring that such advice givers be licensed. So when I say this is fluid, this is a great example of how quickly all of this stuff is moving. A colleague of mine, a forensic psychologist in Canada, got into a Twitter argument with a physician over issues related to gender dysphoria, casually referred to him as Honey Bunch, and Honey Bunch filed a complaint against the psychologist with their licensing board in Canada, and the board agreed that those interactions had been unprofessional and risked damage to public trust. Bandy Lee is a psychiatrist who lost faculty position at Yale for publicly diagnosing Trump and Dershowitz, raising, again, now concerns about Goldwater rule and all of the issues of, ethics around not making statements around clinical health or diagnosis of people that we haven't evaluated. This was just a fascinating example.
This one. So I think part of the thing we think about in terms of test security is making sure that information doesn't fall into the wrong hands. So part part of that is not publishing specific questions from exams. For example, when you write up reports and you give the MMPI, you're not going to include specific questions that are on the MMPI. And so I think most of us probably remember, I think this was back in 2020, Donald Trump at the time, there was some concern about his cognitive abilities, and he went online, or he was in an interview, and he talked about how he had taken the MOCA and how he had, gotten 100% on the MOCA.
He got the best score any doctors have ever seen.
Or anyone could get. And he listed some words that fortunately were not actually the real words. But I think it was like person, something, something. And what kind of came from this is there were some doctors that did some research on the impact of Trump's statements. And what they found was that in the days after he announced that he passed this exam, there were 190 articles published about the MOCA. And what they found was that in more than half of those publications, the authors included several exam questions. And 84 of those 190 articles actually presented readers with the full test, either presenting it in the body of the article or linking the readers to the test itself. And obviously the concern was, does that sort of negate the validity of the test? If you have people who have seen it, they certainly have a sense of what the purpose of it is. You've got, likely hundreds of thousands of people getting access to this test. Does that impact the validity of it? And I think the research was kind of mixed on this topic. I think some people felt like, maybe there's a possibility that this could happen. And so the recommendation was, at least for the time being, if you can, try to use another kind of mental status examination. But I think, that was a couple years ago. So I think it'd be interesting to look at now kind of the effects of that. But I think something obviously to keep in mind, whether it's the MOCA or the MFAST or the MMPIs, we always want to make sure we're not publishing any information on social media that could diminish the validity or reliability of the test.
And the Rorschach images and TAT images are all over social media and the internet. Where I think we wanted to end was simply recommending that, each psychologist needs to make their own decision around how they want to navigate these issues or not. I do think that it's really important that we recognize that social media by psychologists is not in isolation, but it is a part of their entire public professional image that impacts their marketing, whether they have websites or not, driving traffic to their website, getting business. If you ever want to publish a book, your publisher is going to ask you, how many social media followers have you got? Because that is going to impact their willingness to contract you for sales. And remember that even non-public comments made at a party, not in writing, can end up on social media as somebody puts a quote out there attributed to you. I do think, though, it's important. If we don't engage with this information in the public sphere, we see the damage of the people who do, such as some of the current online trends around self-diagnosis. So we leave it all up to all of you, and we've got 10 minutes. So I'm going to end sharing. And Molly, let me see. So if folks have questions or comments, we'd really love to hear them. Post them in the chat, and or Anthony can call on people to ask questions if they're raising their hand. I'm not sure if we can see that.
Yeah, thank you so much, David and Molly, I see we do have some questions already posted in the Q&A. I can throw some of those out your way.
Oh, there you go. I was looking at the chat and not the Q&A. I'm sorry. See, I need to use this better so that I can try and navigate it. So
getting familiar with
yeah, there you go. Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Diana left LinkedIn when a former patient from a forensic facility tried to contact. Yeah, I mean, if you're on social media, you need to be prepared that current and former patients will contact you. I do make very clear statements to anybody that contacts me on social media that any information I give them is not me taking them on as a patient, is not me giving clinical advice. I refer them to sources, but don't give clear information.
And I think one of the things for those of you who do therapy, something to consider is to maybe kind of make that a part of your informed consent process. So when you're doing an intake and talking about, hey, if I see you in public, I'm probably not going to say hi, kind of including information about social media in that informed consent and just taking, maybe a stance like, hey, I'm not going to, accept your friend requests on social media, just so it's kind of clear from the get-go.
Yep. There's a comment about the APA guidelines, and it was the ASPPB guidelines that I think potentially could suffer from a First Amendment challenge. Of course, the ASPPB is a private organization. They're not a governmental organization. First Amendment is held to government organizations. However, boards that the ASPPB is giving guidelines to are government institutions. But it points out that, it also puts us in a bit of a vice grip around holding the profession publicly accountable, which I think is important, as seen by Jordan Peterson and the impact that some of his statements might have on those of us, identifying as psychologists. Noticing one of you is PsyD and other PhD, do you think that makes a difference? I don't know, Molly. I mean, have you noticed?
I haven't, again, I'm not really on social media, so I don't know. I think it, maybe depending on, I think these days PhD and PsyD do kind of similar stuff. I think maybe if you're more on like the research side of things, I could see kind of the utility of social media, like David had mentioned. Having access to more participants for research can be really beneficial. Disseminating research online. I think there's so much research that gets posted on sites like Reddit and Twitter. And so I think that can be really valuable. But in terms of PsyD versus PhD, I don't know that I notice any difference. I don't know if you...
Yeah, I finally started specifically identifying as Dr. David Lay because I was tired of having to defend my training and expertise against people with kind of self-declared expertise and lifestyle gurus and stuff. But I don't know that the public, especially the online public, really know the difference between a PhD and PsyD. Joseph asks an interesting question. I mentioned this about the potential disadvantages of advertising yourself as a psychologist versus shrink. So in that case with my colleague who, referred to somebody online as Honey Bunch, the board specifically noted that he identified himself as psychologist in his social media profile. And that, I think, draws attention to, if you identify yourself as psychologist and you make statements about things that are related to psychology, then is the board able to say, in this statement, you are speaking as a psychologist. And so we, as the Board of Psychology, are going to hold you responsible to our standards. I think that that's an argument that can be made. And can be a little distinct, I think, from if you make a comment on your personal social media where you don't identify yourself as, as psychologist, but you're just wife or husband or father or parent, that you're more clearly not speaking as a psychologist. I will say that my public presence is blended of both my psychology, author, sex therapy, and black belt in jiu-jitsu. I get a lot of attention around that, and that has actually been part of my intent, is that I believe it's responsible to present myself as a person and a whole person, and not limit my opinions. But again, this is personal preference. Has anything, oh, hi, Renee, has anything ever happened that made me rethink or reconsider having such a public presence? Yeah, I mean, I've been doxxed. I've had pizzas show up at my house, ordered by people that, it's like this online prank people do. I've had people online go after my family. That was one of the things that really kind of gave me pause. But again, I'm in a pretty controversial kind of stance, which I kind of enjoy. So I have wrestled with all of that. But I will say also that trying to get me off the internet would be almost impossible right now, even if I stopped, posting or presenting at all, because there's so much information out there. And folks asked, are there companies out there to clean up one's internet presence? You can Google those. They're, the image consultants and image cleanup or image rehabilitation kind of folks. I'm not sure any one of them is better than the other. And again, even with my auto deleting of social media stuff, people can use what's called the Wayback Machine to go back and find stuff that you've deleted from the internet that was there in previous iterations. So once it's there, it's there. It can be harder work to find it. But I use some strategies to make it, if somebody wants to find stuff, they have to work a little harder.
And I think Deborah raises a good point in the questions about living in a small town versus living in a large city, and how does that impact social media use? So Deborah mentions that she lives in a rural area and keeps herself off social media. Is this a woman who lives alone? And I think that raises a good issue too, in terms of, gender. For me, doing the work that I do, that's certainly something that I always kind of kept in the back of my mind, is what is my risk for having an online presence? I imagine David doesn't worry as much about some of those things as I might. I think, and I live in a larger city, so it's a little bit easier, but I think those are important things to consider.
And Richard identifies that, even though his settings are locked down and doesn't identify himself as a psychologist, friends will reach out and ask them a question, and as a psychologist. And so I think that we have to be present and thoughtful around these issues constantly. And just because you don't have a professional public presence doesn't mean that these issues can't become problems that you have to wrestle with and contemplate as you move forward. And again, I think that there are generational issues. These issues are moving fast and furious. And with every new social media, I mean, we're hearing about TikTok's security issues. With every new social media, there are new nuanced problems, challenges, and opportunities that present that we all have to wrestle with. But keeping in mind some of these basic principles about protecting confidentiality, informed consent, being mindful and aware of our professional statements, and using reasonable strategies to mitigate risk. I think that the benefits outweigh the risks, but this is a question for every psychologist. Anthony, I think, are we at the end? Do we want to stay? Are there more questions?
We have reached the top of the hour, so just to clarify for our audience, you are free to go whenever. But if David and Molly, you're willing to stay for another extra 2 or 3 minutes to wrap up some questions, we'd be happy for that.
Yeah, I'll point out, Dawn made a comment that even if you don't have an online presence, people can go after you. And, I've seen patients present recordings of therapy sessions that they made without the therapist's consent and posting them online, inviting other people to criticize the psychologist statements or approaches. So unfortunately, I mean, this is a brave, scary new world. And yeah, Desiree identifies she researches a pretty charged topic. And God help you if you are researching on pedophilia or child, sexual abuse material, got ivermectin or conspiracy theories. I know a researcher on QAnon that their life is kind of challenging. These issues can be really frightening. I mean, after I appeared on the Daily Show a couple of years ago talking about the Proud Boys, the founder of Proud Boys then saw the episode and spent about a week sending me these 2 a.m. drunken, threatening emails. So it's really wild how small the world can get, how quickly. All right. Oh, and that is what Desiree researches. Congratulations, Desiree. Thanks for doing it. It's important, critical work. But again, I guess I'll just close here and say that I think that the more we take thoughtful, informed stances on this, the better we can help each other and psychology as a profession around this. I do think it's not really fair for older psychologists that are not on social media and didn't grow up with this as part of their life to say that younger clinicians should not be on social media. I think that is a relatively ignorant and uninformed stance, and you may be offended by me saying that, but I don't think it's fair. And I think that the benefits for social media for our younger psychologists or our older psychologists, because I'm 50 now, is worthwhile for us as clinicians and psychologists to consider in a reasonable and thoughtful way, rather than a knee-jerk kind of approach that may be antiquated at this point.
Right. Like it's not going to go away. We're not going to just, social media is here to stay. And I think rather than take the approach of like, no, not at all, what we need to be doing is establishing guidelines for clinicians and helping kind of regulate it so that it can be a safe and useful place for folks.
That's right. And while we've been doing this today, I live tweeted it to a degree and put out some pictures of us doing this. And some of you have followed me, and thank you for that. Yeah. Nice to know all of you. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks.
David, Molly, thank you so much for this. I'm sure you gave people a lot to think about and perhaps rethink in terms of their approach to social media and how we can or may want to use it. That wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. We hope to see you again next week when we have Joel Davoskin talking about class mental health lawsuits. Until then, take care and think about what you post or not post on social media.